on the day of a Franco-British Summit in northern France. We're talking about the prospect of a Brexit and how it would impact here, the French. We're talking about it in the company of two British who live here in Paris. Alex Taylor, journalist, welcome back. Welcome back as well to Amber Minogi, stand-up comedian. Any gigs coming up?
Every Friday.
Every Friday? Tell us where.
Friday.
All right, here's your free plug moment. Go ahead.
Every Friday at 8 o'clock at the Somme Gymnase, we have WTF Paris.
And where is that? Which part of Paris is that in?
It's on the Grand Boulevard. It's where we deal with the problems for mainly expats and also, French people living in Paris.
Okay. Also in the company of Bruno Bernard, who is a staff member of the Paris City Council and a member of the Les Républicains party.
Yes.
And from London, we're in the company of Alexandra Swan, who is campaigning for a Brexit. We were talking about the European Union. At the outset, it was designed to keep the Germans and the French from killing each other. Now today, France and Germany may be the motor of the Eurozone, but the numbers of where the interests of the French lie might be a very different matter. At the end of 2014, there were an estimated 160,000 of us French living in Germany, 300,000 in Britain. By the way, in the other direction, 400,000 Brits live here in France, 4 times more than the Germans. And Alex Taylor is somebody who does a lot of press reviews, as you were saying in part one of our discussion. I notice it all the time. The French, they don't really care about what goes on in Germany, do they? They're much more focused on what's happening in Britain.
I think, for being British but living in France, I think that our two countries have a problem. Basically, I think the French are pretty indifferent to Europe. I think they don't really care very much about Europe. It's very hard. For example, I've been trying to do programs about Europe on French television for the last 30 years, and everybody is so l'Europe n'intéresse personne. Europe doesn't interest everybody. Britain has another problem. They care a lot about Europe, but in a very kind of like negative way. The coverage of Europe in the British media is absolutely scandalous. I mean, if you watch a debate on British television about Europe, it's usually between an anti-EU person and somebody who's vaguely kind of convinced that on balance it's probably a bit better, but we don't like Europe anyway.
But is it fair to say that the French are more interested in Britain than they are in anything else that happens?
I don't know if the French are that interested in Britain. The French are, people are forever ringing me up, for example, because I'm on French television, I used to be a lot, and people ring me up, they want me to talk about the royal family or about Monty Python or things. Our two countries have this kind of warped view of each other.
Football.
Like, which is stuck about 50 years ago. You can't do a programme in Britain about France without there being accordion music and so forth. You can't talk about Britain in France without talking about the royal family and les British and all the rest of it. These countries have moved on. I think we're very much stuck in the mythology, which is based kind of just after the Second World War. It's very strange because you don't see Germany like that, for example. French people see Germany as it is today, as a kind of modern, vibrant democracy. But our two views of each other are very much caught in a kind of time warp in the past.
But the French tend to be fascinated with London. You have to bear that in mind. Maybe not with the UK, but with London.
And Amber Minogi, is that changing? Could that change if there's a Brexit? The way the French view Britain and the way the British view France?
Maybe, but I think the Brexit is so little understood. I mean, I think it's very true that the British, it's this love-hate relationship. They're very interested in everything that goes on in France, but it's very much like a cliche. They imagine France to be this sort of cliche in the same way that the French imagine Britain to be rather a cliche. And they enjoy, perpetuating these myths of each other.
But, as a French national, I'd like to give my opinion on it. It's just, I think that most of French people as individual already think that the UK is outside the EU because they're not in the Eurozone, they're not in Schengen, and they've been complaining about Europe since 1974. So for them, it won't do much. But they will keep on going to London because they love London. That's it. They don't go outside London. They don't know anything about England, but they go to London and they just love it over there.
Won't do much, except, of course, in those border areas. You were mentioning northern France at the outset of our broadcast, but also the Southwest, where there are loads of places where, there's even a British mayor, I think, in one
Well,
village.
there's one British mayor in Normandy, actually, which is a great thing, I think. Well, you have to thank the British community established there, because they've revitalized some of the dying villages in the southwest of France. So, of course, they speak only British and they stay among themselves, and they have their own little local newspaper that only written in English, of course. But, I mean, to be fair to them, those villages were dying. So,
But what would you do if, for example, the UK does stop letting French people come and work in London and stop?
What would they?
Would you?
What would they?
Well, because it's not at all sure, because they can work there. Their right, my rights to work here is because my country belongs to the European Union. I mean, for example, Switzerland's always cited as an example of a country outside the European Union. I read the Swiss papers every day. It's full of complaints by young Swiss people who don't have the same rights as all the Europeans around them to do Erasmus programs and so forth. How can you be sure that if Brexit happens, that if Britain throws out...
I do tend to believe in British pragmatism and the fact that whenever there's a possibility to attract talent, especially in London, they will do anything they can to keep that going.
Well, why are they doing Brexit?
It sounds like you're speaking about the Arsenal Football Club.
Why are they...
Not recently.
But this seems to be the problem. It's sort of like Britain wants to have this special relationship where it can pick and choose.
Exactly.
Oh, we want this and we don't want that. We want this and we don't want that. And the Brexit, in a way, we think it doesn't really exist. It's not really going to happen. They're just going to argue and have a little tantrum and then pick and choose, and nothing's going to change. So what are they talking about? I mean, why are we having this enormous debate if no one believes anything's going to change?
Oh, it's going to be massive. If Brexit happens, I mean, the European Union has no interest whatsoever in making Brexit easy for Britain. If the European Union makes Brexit easy, everybody, you're going to have Czechs, the Czechs will be out, the Dutch will be out, and so forth. It's in the European Union's interest to make the whole process of Brexit as complicated as possible. It's going to take us 10 years to renegotiate the same deals that we have at the moment. I just don't get it.
Just one last point about France and Brexit. You have to bear in mind that the last two countries who voted in a referendum on Europe were the Netherlands and France, and they both said no to the EU constitution. And that's, I think, a thought that you have to bear in mind when you ask people about Europe in referendums. They have the tendency to say no, which is...
Which says what about Europe?
Well, it's not very attractive, apparently.
Well, they also have a tendency to not want to change.
Who?
Just to stick with, the status quo.
At the end of the day, Alexandra Swan, they said for the Scottish referendum that it would be very close, that the Scots may leave. In the end, it was a 10-point margin. Do the British like scaring themselves, and in the end, they'll stay in Europe?
I think there's a lot of comparisons that can be drawn already with the projects of fear, both in the Scottish referendum and exactly the same in the EU referendum. We have huge amounts of money pouring in from Brussels and the UK government supporting staying in the European Union, all their arguments, none of them are positive. So on the Leave side, we're not talking about migration. It's not about that. That's one of the smaller elements. And I think I agree very much with what Bruno was saying earlier, that London's not going to turn down good talent just because there isn't completely free movement of often unskilled labour. If someone is talented and will be good to come, it's like saying we don't take talented people and students from America, from China. It's just utter rubbish. And to pick up on Alex's point about this Europhobic press we have in the UK, what about The Guardian, The Independent? Even The Times is wavering. We only have two outright Eurosceptic papers in The Telegraph and The Daily Mail. It's just utterly ridiculous to use this Europhobic term. The British press has diversified so much to the point where, if anything, when you have on the BBC, it tends to be more pro-EU voices all the time. We get rammed down our throats just how terrifying it might be if we leave the EU and we dare to take back the sovereignty and make our own laws and control our borders. Obviously, that means that Britain just couldn't survive.
Do you have any idea of the circulation figures for the newspapers you've just talked about? The Daily Mail is one of the most looked at sites in the world. So is the Daily Telegraph. The Guardian has kind of minimal figures, and the Independent, which you just quoted, has just gone out of business and no longer exists as a newspaper. The British press is vastly Europhobic. I mean, you talk about vast sums of money coming in from Brussels. I don't know where these vast sums of money go, but I can tell you the British press is kind of 90% Europhobic. I read it every morning. I read articles which grossly untrue about the effect of Brussels on the lives of British people every day in the British press. And it's quite scandalous. There's a very small element of the British press which is pro-European.
All right, in the middle...
There's something you said...
Very briefly, go ahead.
You say there that the Daily Mail is read really widely across the world. That doesn't really matter, does it? It's about who reads it, who can actually vote in the UK. Who cares about the worldwide viewing figures of the Mail online?
Well, it's read in Britain and across the world.
As we're hearing, the fight over this Brexit referendum is only just beginning. For that referendum in June, we have that going on. What's happening in Calais and the battlefields of the Somme this Thursday, the backdrop of that 34th Franco-British Summit, a reminder that 100 years ago, the two nations were side by side in the trenches of World War I. Claire Williams has the story.
100 years ago, British and French soldiers fought side by side in these fields. In the Battle of the Somme's centenary year, Britain and France are holding their 34th annual summit close to the old battlefields in northern France. Top of the agenda, the migrants camped out in and around Calais who are trying to reach the UK.
And today I can announce that we will invest an additional £17 million in priority security infrastructure in Calais to assist the work of the French police. The money will go towards efforts to move people from the camps in Calais to facilities elsewhere in France, and we will fund joint work to return migrants not in need of protection to their home countries.
Cameron also took the opportunity to argue against a Brexit, saying Britain's borders would be more secure if the country stayed in the EU. As French authorities continue to dismantle parts of the jungle camp in Calais, French police, bound by European border agreements, patrol the area to stop migrants jumping on lorries and crossing the Channel to Britain. Without specifying what they would be, Hollande said there would be consequences if Britain left the EU.
This won't put into question the historic friendly relationship between France and the UK, but there will be consequences, including in terms of how the migration situation is handled.
France is also trying to convince migrants in Calais to apply for asylum in France, efforts Cameron applauded. But when it comes to unaccompanied minors with family in Britain, both leaders agreed to make the process of transferring them to the UK easier and faster.
There's an element as well that we should mention in the bilateral relationship between Britain and France, Bruno Bernard, and that's defense. The French and the British have downsized their armies over the years. They rely a lot on each other. Is that relationship going to change?
Well, since it's been a completely exclusive relationship between the two, considering that the other European countries have not weighed in or participated militarily to any exterior action, military action, I mean, it will have to stay that way. It will have to, the cooperation between the two, the defense cooperation between the two will have to stay strong and remain that way, because these are the two armies left in Europe that are able to actually do something about things and the state of the world. So I'm sure it will have some impact, but you know we'll always have NATO to play within.
Alex Taylor, it's sort of an awkward situation, isn't it? If a Britain outside of Europe but will be France's closest ally on defense matters.
I just don't get it. I think the world is becoming a very dangerous place to be. I think there's a threat of terrorism from the Middle East. I think there's these big blocks coming up, and I do not understand the logic of people who say, oh, it's best if we come out of and be all by ourselves. Because on top of it, if we come out and be all by ourselves, as you mentioned, first of all, it's going to break up the United Kingdom. The day after Brexit is, if the referendum goes for Britain to leave the European Union, then the Scots will call a referendum the very next day, and the United Kingdom will break up. So basically, you're going to be left with England and Wales outside of one of these blocks. I don't get the logic of, in a dangerous world, we're not still in 1945. We're in a dangerous world with idiots like in North Korea.
But as Bruno Bernard said, this is defense, or, well, that's NATO's business. It's not the EU's
well, it's
business.
NATO's business, but I mean, Europe is our closest neighbour. I just don't understand the point of isolating yourself, whether it be from NATO. If we were sitting here debating whether to leave NATO, I would say, what is the point? I don't get it. I don't get the point from a defence point of view of isolating ourselves, breaking up the country, and leaving our nearest neighbours with whom we have very good relationships. I just simply do not understand it.
Alexandra Swan?
To talk about defence and how we'd be safer within the European Union, where we don't have complete control over who comes to the country, and we will probably be subject to taking in even more migrants. We have no idea who most of these people are. There's a huge proportion of young men, many of them economic migrants, but we've no idea, frankly, who everyone is. To say that staying within a conglomerate, this mass of nations where we can't control, as part of that, because of free movement, who comes to the UK. I think that, we'd have to talk about what difference does it make about Scotland being attached to England. It's not about that. It's not about size of landmass anymore. It's about having basic controls over who can come into the country, because we're not talking about we're not talking about huge land armies here. ISIS or North Korea are not going to send an army. We've seen that it's more about individuals going in and causing terror and committing terrorist atrocities. Yeah, and if we had a lot more control over who's entering the country, we'd have a lot more control over the sort of people we have here.
Yeah, those individuals are not necessarily from abroad. I mean, those individuals can also be from France, from the UK. I mean, the idea of reducing communication at this point seems ridiculous. I mean, I completely agree. We should.
I don't know. I mean, every time I go into the UK, I go there once a month, I have to show my passport. It's not part of Schengen. I do not understand the point you're making about not having any control of borders. We are not part of Schengen. Every time I leave and go into the UK, I have to queue up and show my passport. Exactly. They look at it and find out who I am. What is this argument about the fact that we don't control our borders? Because we're in the EU. The United Kingdom has opted out of Schengen. We do control our borders more than any other country in Europe. What would change if we left the European Union? It's nonsense.
Alexandra Swan?
It's not so much the control of borders, it's more the idea of uncontrolled migration and freedom of movement. So yes, people can come in, but in a couple of years' time, people, a lot of these migrants will start naturalising as soon as they become citizens of Europe. That means they can come straight to the UK. So this is not, if you look, I'm a big fan of immigration. As I said, I used to live in Europe. I personally think, I hate the fact that this debate over EU membership has come down to migration. I think that's so damaging to the Brexit cause. But unfortunately, a lot of the British public see immigration as one of the biggest problems. And whilst Cameron might have tinkered around the edges, he's not actually making any. There's going to be no difference whatsoever about this idea of freedom of movement. So of course, yeah, you show your passport, but it doesn't mean that anyone who has a European passport can't settle in the UK.
But I mean, this idea you were saying about British people thinking that migration is such a big problem. Well, the reason I think that is because that's what the politicians talk about all the time. They're not talking about the other issues, making it clear. I think a lot of people are really confused about what it actually means. And so they're bandying around this idea of immigration, and it's terribly frightening, and this jungle will descend on Britain, unless we leave instantly. And so that's why people are worried about it.
It's not an only British problem. I mean, the migration and immigrants is an all-European problem, and it's a fear that is well spread throughout Europe. Look at Marine Le Pen numbers in France, for example, which are quite worrying. I think what Brexit and what the discussion is about in the UK just reveals all the failure of the European Union. I mean, we could have done something when it came to defence. We didn't, because nobody...
The idea was bandied about in the 1980s of having a European corps.
Eurocorps. Franco-German. There's a few hundred guys sitting on their hands somewhere in Germany. Or it's useless. It's completely useless. I mean, we've talked about a European defence in 1954. And since then, nothing has happened. And the only country that has come with France to do something about defence was the UK, and it had nothing to do with the EU. So just to be fair to the Brexit campaign, the EU is not perfect. We would like Britain to remain and have an influence over European institutions within a lot more than outside, because staying outside, and I know how much the Brits, how much they like to be in the club than outside the door of the club. So, you know, stay in the club and use your influence to the best, because at the end of the day, it won't solve anyone's problems just to leave us like that.
You just said something interesting. You said since 1954 nothing has happened. Something has happened, and I don't know if anybody has noticed it. Peace. I mean,
had nothing to do with the EU. Sorry, I can't let you. No.
EU.
It had nothing to do with the EU.
Nothing to do with the
Peace
EU.
has got nothing to do with the fact that now
the peace was due to the fact that you had the Soviet Union on one side and the US or NATO on the other.
No, I don't agree.
The fear of nuclear destruction.
But the First and the Second World War was a question of quite smaller countries. It wasn't these big blocs. And I think if we weren't in a trading group together where we see each other as partners all the time, it's now totally inconceivable. The EU has brought about the fact that now war between France and Germany, big enemies in the Second World War.
Nuclear bombs have actually changed the way we.
Well, yeah,
war
but also the
between France and
European
Germany.
Union has had a huge role in. My father fought in the Second World War, and he's got medals for it. And the very first thing he did when his young boy, me, when I was 10 years old, was he took him around Europe because he said, never again. And this is the reason I live in Europe now and I feel so strongly about the European Union. Young people sometimes forget that up until 70 years ago, we were decimating each other, bombing cities, killing people left, right and centre. 2 world wars originated in Europe. I mean, it's now inconceivable. And I think the European Union partnership, trade partnerships, all this kind of like discussion, collaboration we've had together is largely responsible for that.
All right, one final question. I'll put it to Alexandra Swan very briefly. The pressure we've heard this Thursday from the likes of the French president, will that sway people to vote for or against staying in Europe?
I don't think it will really make very much difference at all. Once again, it's something that's been threatened. It's something that adds to this whole project of fear. But I think it's a very small thing, and this is going to be a long campaign for everyone involved. And I think this will be something that will be forgotten fairly quickly.
Alexandra Swan in London, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Amber Minogue, Alex Taylor, Bruno Bernard. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
So the Franco-British Summit coming in the middle, as we see, of a major storm here in the build-up to that Brexit referendum.
Yes, absolutely, and lots of people wondering whether that's entirely intentional or not. It is something that is really dominating the British papers, as you might expect right now. This particular cartoon, I think, is probably my favourite image of the day. It looks very much like a Kent pub sign, you might say, the Cock and Bulldog. You've got François.
This is from Adams in the Telegraph.
Absolutely. And a very unflattering cartoon there of David Cameron saying Calais will come to Kent and looking really very concerned about it. Now, the timing...
It's better, though, to be a bulldog than a poodle.
That's true, actually. He got off quite lightly. But then I suppose you wouldn't get a pub called the Cock and Poodle. But anyway, the timing of this is it's twofold, really, because it comes on the same day as obviously the Franco-Anglo Summit, but also the very day that the Minister for Europe has signed the EU referendum date into law. So the UK will have its say on the 23rd of June. There is no stopping this runaway train now. It is definitely going to happen. But lots of people are concerned by the timing and the calls for... has this been pre-arranged by Number 10? They're pretty loud. Left Foot Forward is obviously a very left-leaning website. They say that France's leaders have been behind David Cameron all the way, and this has all been very, very much planned for the event. They say that the refugees being the threat of moving the refugees from Calais to Kent with no more British border checks taking place on French soil. They say it's extremely convenient that Macron has echoed the Prime Minister's most potent threats. Because, of course, that is exactly what he's been talking about, this kind of project fear that everyone's
So they think it's
referring.
all coordinated between
Absolutely. Now, David Cameron has denied this, saying there is no conspiracy. He said it's simply nonsense to imply that that is the case. But it does certainly play into this idea of the project fear. If we take a look at the Daily Telegraph, though, they have an opinion piece that says no one should be afraid of anything in particular because this is an empty threat from France, and she dismisses it as simply silly. Julia Hartley-Brewer wrote this particular article. She says, if we're foolhardy enough to vote to leave, the very next day we'll be overrun by illegal migrants in their tens of thousands, rampaging through the Channel Tunnel and pouring onto ferries. She is, of course, being sarcastic, saying it simply won't happen. Now, she goes on to say that the facts are against this, but then doesn't actually list any facts. All she says is a vote to leave the EU will not lead to an end to border controls at Calais. It just won't. So not a lot of facts there. As for public reaction, we've got things like this. Emmanuel Macron claims irrational and hollow. Camps are there because of Channel, not bilateral treaties that are not linked to EU membership. This particular writer says that, perhaps we could reclaim Calais while we're about it. But that's obviously not going to happen.
Calais, which was British for many centuries.
Indeed, it was. And Macron's threatening to open borders. Do it, we'll protect our own as always. Why would any banker want to go to a country with 75% tax?
OK. And the French, how are they weighing in on this conversation?
Well, it's interesting to see that certainly it's not getting as much reaction in France as it is in the UK, perhaps understandably, because it's the UK that feels it's been threatened by this claim. But there are some reactions out there, and this one is a particularly interesting one. The migrants are supposed to be welcome here with us, but the socialists are using them as a weapon against England. That's an interesting viewpoint on this one. Another one saying that an alternative plan for Calais would be to send everyone to England, first class on Eurostar, and then close the tunnel. And this person says, France is not a waiting room for migrants going to England. Let them go or send them back.
All right, Emma James, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.